Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. Welcome. It is an honor to introduce you today the keynote of this morning, who is Professor Constantine Sedikides. Constantine Sedikides, originally from Greece, he immigrated and acculturated in the United States for many years. He was professor there. And in the last 10, 12 years, he is back in Europe, but now it's no more Europe, or it will not be more Europe. He's in the United Kingdom. And then he's professor there in the University of Southampton. He's a world expert in the social psychology of self and identity. He has been president of the International Society for Self and Identity. And he has received numerous awards for his scientific work across the years. The most recent one being the Career Award of the International Society for Self and Identity, that it is just an encouragement to continue for the next 30, 40 years doing research. And also, I think it was 2013, he became a fellow, so academician of the British Royal Academy of Social Sciences. He's a well-known expert in the psychology of self in general, but in particular with regard to specific topics like nostalgia. He's the nostalgia and ostalgia guy. And also narcissism, modesty, self-enhancement, and more recently, but it's no more recently because now it makes a decade, he has been interested also on religion, and in particular in collaboration with Joachim Gebauer, who has been a postdoc working with Constantine. They developed and they published exciting work that makes things further, especially trying to see how culture moderates what we previously knew about, for instance, religion and well-being or religion and personality. So it is in this line that the abstract of this talk is inserted. So thanks a lot, Constantine, and we are eager to listen to your talk.
Thank you, Vassilis, for your kind introduction. Thanks the organizers, Pavel in particular, for having me here, and thanks all of you for turning up this morning. I appreciate that. There are all kinds of talks one can give, and I'm sure you've heard them all. You can classify talks on a number of dimensions. One of them is breadth versus depth. One can give a broad talk, arguably at the expense of empirical coverage, of detailed empirical coverage. And these talks are perhaps more appropriate as keynote addresses. Or one can give a talk that has a somewhat narrow theoretical focus, but is deeper in empirical coverage. These talks are inappropriate for a keynote address, and that's what I'm going to do today. I want to ask the students in the audience to tell me who this person is. Do you know? Oh. I was in this conference a couple of weeks ago, and a colleague in an existential mood, apparently, asked me, do you think 100 years from now will be remembered? Do you think 100 years from now our work will be remembered? And I said, no. But this man should be remembered. He wrote a classic 130 years ago, Principles of Psychology. It's William James, who he's a brilliant writer. I read his book more than once, and I must say that about 2/3 of it is nonsense, brilliantly written nonsense. But a couple of chapters are good. One is on emotions, the other is on the self. He set the agenda for research on the self about writing about 130 years ago. One of the things that James said is this, and I quote him. Well, he said, I'm a psychologist, so of course psychology is important to me. It's important for me to know a lot about psychology. Do not criticize me for being a bad psychologist. I'm going to get you sooner or later. But he said, I'm not a linguist. I couldn't care less about Greek, although if you ask me, he should. No problem. He might as well have said, if gardening is important to me, I'll think that I'm a really good gardener, better than my neighbor gardeners. If parenting is important to me, I think that I'm a good parent and my children are more special than other people's children, and so on and so forth. Arguably, what James was saying is that people self-enhance on traits that are central to them, on dimensions that are important to them, not on unimportant ones. Along with Johann Gebauer, whom Vassilis mentioned, we termed this principle the self-centrality breeds self-enhancement principle, and for love of acronyms, the CC-BRICI principle. Someone told me it sounds like the easy peasy principle, but let's call it CC-BRICI for now. The principle was demonstrated in 1992 by research by D. Joy. He surveyed men and women in terms of how good a driver they thought they were. He found that both men and women thought they were better drivers than the average driver, right? But men more so than women, possibly because driving back then was more important for men than women. In a nice study, Brown did the right thing, which is to manipulate trait importance. He told half of his participants that a bunch of random traits are important to have in the sense that they are associated with success in life, professional, relational, health, you name it. He told another group of participants that the very same traits are okay to have and okay not to have. They're not, they don't really predict much. What he found is that participants who were told that the traits were important rated themselves as better than average on those traits. Participants who were told that the traits are unimportant did not do that. So when we learn that something is important to us, or when we think that something is important to us, this something, we rate ourselves as superior on this something. We derive self-worth from it. We derive self-esteem from it. It's a central part of our identity. Our life depends on it. We better be better than others and distinguish ourselves on that. The principle has been honored, regarded as an essential part of human nature. This is one way in which we relate to our social environment. It's considered to be universal. It's a marker of psychological health. If you don't do that, you may have a little problem. Depressed people don't do that, for example. And also, it's been a psychological block of much of theory. I'm citing here a few theories that rely on this principle directly, and I'm not citing another theory, the self-concept tactician model that Struby and I developed, which also relies on that theory, extends it, and tries to understand self-evaluation in cross-cultural context. However, this presumably well-established principle has been challenged, and why not, by a view that we call the ego-quieting view. According to this view, the CC-BRICI principle is sort of a temptation, a fancy. It's not really serious stuff. It doesn't constitute an essential part of human nature. It's not universal. And in fact, it all depends. Thus, it depends on the strength of norms, cultural, societal norms. I think we thought this was a very, very interesting proposition, worth taking seriously. If the ego-quieting view is correct, you'd expect it to manifest itself in context like this. In East Asian culture, which presumably values modesty and humility and self-effacement. Among religious persons, Christians in this case, for whom humility is important. And also among yoga or meditation practitioners, for whom the underlying philosophy is that the self either does not exist or you need to eradicate the self. So what we wanted to do then is to provide a critical test of the CC-BRICI principle in those three contexts to see whether indeed the ego-quieting view is valid. Let's start with East Asian culture first. This is the biggest part of my talk. It's going to take some time to get through it, maybe about 10 minutes or so. The rest of it is easy peasy. Colleagues have taken the legitimate viewpoint that the Sisi-Brisi principle is absent in East Asian culture, and in fact, the reverse is true. So, for example, in Japan, if our colleagues are professional psychologists, cultural psychologists, they would think that they're worse than other cultural psychologists. They stink on cultural psychology, right? So if you think something is important to you, you are bad at it. Some data don't seem to suggest that this is so. Among Japanese university students, Chinese Singaporean students, Japanese non-students, and so on and so forth. In fact, a meta-analysis that students that I conducted seem to indicate that whatever is important to people, they will self-enhance on. So if modesty is important to Japanese, they think that they're superior on modesty compared to other Japanese. And of course, the ego-quieting view proponents argue that in another meta-analysis that, well, overall, East Asians do not self-enhance. So it seems that the issue has not been settled for at least two good reasons. One reason has to do with the measurement of self-enhancement. Much of this research, for example, is based on the better-than-average effect, and it should not. We should have multiple measures of self-enhancement, and here we had three of them. The communal version of the better-than-average effect, communal narcissism, I'll explain soon what this means, and communal overclaiming. Like IQ intelligence researchers take the G factor of intelligence, here we took the G factor of self-enhancement, shared variance among those three measures of self-enhancement. What do they have in common? And this is what we capitalized on. There is another issue of serious disagreement, the issue of Westernization. The idea is that, well, even if you find self-enhancement among East Asians, this is because Western culture has spread so much around the world that these days everyone is a little Westerner, so everyone will self-enhance. For that reason, we had two groups in China. One is Chinese university students who are supposed to be Westernized and tend to listen to Western songs and so on and so forth, and the other Chinese state officials, hardcore communists who value interdependence and collectivism more so than Chinese college students who are relatively unwesternized. I'll explain soon the significance of it after I describe the first study we did, where we tested Chinese university students and Chinese state employees and administered a passion scale. To what extent are you passionate for Chinese cultural values? They were both passionate, but as predicted, Chinese state employees were more passionate than Chinese college students. Another way to put it, in the context of the Sisi-Brisi principle, is that for Chinese state employees, Chinese culture is more important, right? We measured a communal better-than-average effect, the extent to which our participants, Chinese university students and employees, state employees, thought they were superior to their peers on a variety of traits, like sympathetic, polite, agreeable, or communal traits. We measured communal narcissism with an inventory, a scale that Johann Gebauer and I developed. This assesses the extent of sainthood, the extent to which people think that they're saints, that they're going to save the world. They're like the best friend and the most altruistic person ever and the best parent ever, and they're going to eliminate poverty and establish peace on the planet forever. We assessed communal overclaiming, a criterion discrepancy measure, with a set of items we invented. Here we made up 10 communal knowledge domains, like international health charities, Nobel Prize winners, and nature and animal protection organizations. and came up with 3 items per domain. Take, for example, the domain of international health charities. It had 3 items: ASH AIDS Aid, the Stroke Association, and International Children's Heart Foundation. We asked participants to indicate their familiarity with each item. To what extent are you familiar with each of them? Not at all very much. The problem is that, unbeknownst to participants, we fabricated one of those 3 items. So the first item, the AAA item, does not exist. Now, if participants indicate that they really know, they're very familiar with this item, this could be an indication of self-enhancement. So imagine you are a senior psychologist and your 12-year-old daughter or son comes to you with a question about psychology and you don't know the answer, right? If psychology is important to you, you may be more inclined to say that you know something about it, as opposed to if psychology is totally unimportant to you. So that's the idea. It pains, it hurts to admit ignorance on something that's important to you. Besides those 3 measures of self-enhancement, we also looked at measures of, let's call them collectivism or interdependence, both of them, an interdependent subscale of the self-construal scale and an individualism-collectivism scale, the argument being that Chinese state employees ought to score higher on those scales. Right? This is the model, multi-group confirmatory factor analysis. The model fit is good, not amazing, but good. And let me emphasize here that as a culture researcher, of course, I'm fully aware, like everybody else here, of the fact that scales may be perceived differently by members of different cultures. And so we opted not to analyze each of those 3 self-enhancement measures separately, but rather to combine them into this G approach that, again, capitalizes on the communality among the 3 scales and ensures that members of different cultures construe the scales in the same way. So technically speaking, it sets factor loadings and intercepts to unity. The latent mean for the first group is always 0, the group to be compared against college students, so the university students. What to observe here is that the 3 measures load satisfactorily on the G factor, and the loadings are about the same, 0.68, 0.57, 0.66. So the 3 measures contribute an equal share of the variance to the G factor. That's a good thing. This is the state employees' late mean. I could have done a hypothesis testing. I could have adopted a hypothesis testing procedure and given you the chi-square here. Yes, state employees, self-enhance a little more than college students. But a better way to do it would be a Bayesian analysis, where we look at the base factor. What this does is compare directly the Sisi-Brisi principle against the ego-quieting view. It tells you which of those 2 theoretical viewpoints is more likely to be true, viable. And the base factor is a whopping 2.5 trillion. So chances of the ego of the Sisi-Brisi principle being viable against the ego-quieting view is 2.5 trillion to 1. Let's look at university students. Again, you have here a good contribution of those factors of the 2 measures to the G factor. And what this test base factor indicates is that collectivism and interdependence were more important for state employees than for university students, as predicted. And finally, this is the whole model. Okay, what's going on? It's a bit overwhelming. Basically, indicates mediation. So a reason that state employees self-enhance is because collectivism is more important to them. It's truly important to them. You see good mediation, so 54% of the differences between the two groups is accounted for by this mediation. Again, the Sisi-Brisi principle is supported quite strongly by this mediation. A reason state employees self-enhance is because cultural values are important to them, more important to them than to university students. We did another study that I won't describe because it's a bit boring, but we got a base factor of over 500,000 here. So arguably the 2.5 trillion base factor was a bit of a fluke. It's too massive of a number, but still support is very strong across the two studies for the Sisi-Brisi principle. So we are through the first and more tedious part of the talk, East Asian culture. It seems that people in East Asian culture also endorse the Sisi-Brisi principle. They do self-enhance on attributes that are important to them. These data were unpublished. The new set of data, the religiosity data, are published. Why is it that Christianity would quiet the ego? Well, it has been suggested so by various religious authorities, that humility is important to Christianity, superbia, vanity or pride is a deadly sin to be avoided. Loving God is an antidote to loving yourself. Charles Darwin argued, indeed, the same point, that religiosity quiets the ego, and so did Emile Durkheim. And so did several social psychologists. I'm citing here one, but many others have done the same. A belief that, indeed, religiosity calms the ego. The evidence for this is mixed. We have 4 studies on the better-than-average effect. Half of them seem to support the Sisi-Brisi principle, half don't. We have a couple studies on overclaiming. One of them seems to support the principle, the other does not. So a new study is needed in which about 400 Christians are being tested against non-Christians. Our measure here, to begin with, is a 6-item, better-than-average task. Christian commandments. About 4 of those commandments we did not use because they do not produce any variance. A commandment like, you should not kill others, is not going to produce a lot of variance. But the remaining we classified into 2 groups. Faith commandments like, I am the Lord, thy God, shall not have no other gods before me. So if you agree with that, that means you have faith in the religion. And communion commandments like, thou shalt not covet the neighbor's wife. We asked the extent to which participants were more likely, Christian participants were more likely than others to adhere to those commandments. And we asked them also how important it is for them to live up to these commandments. What we found here, the light-shaded box is the control group. The darker shaded box is the Christian group. In terms of faith commandments, well, faith commandments were more important to Christians than non-Christians. That's expected. Communion commandments were important to both, although more important to Christians than non-Christians. The better-than-average effect indicated that Christians self-enhance, think that they're better than average on faith commandments and on communion commandments. So Christians believe that they're superior to others on whatever is important to them, which is commandments, both faith and communion. We did another study like this, which I will not describe, where we obtained the same effect. We replicated that. A reason then Christians self-enhance is because, well, the domain commandments is important to them. Again, this supports the Sisi-Brisi principle. In the final part of my talk, I'd like to talk about mind-body practices. The yoga, the argument is, quiets the ego, reduces self-enhancement. the Asmita, which I learned is Sanskrit for ego quieting, is a foundational principle of Patanjali, which is a leading yoga philosophy. And Asmita is the key reason why yoga is beneficial to you. Basically, humility, ego quieting, is what produces psychological adjustment. And that idea is pretty well accepted in psychology, namely that yoga quiets the ego. Mindfulness meditation is also presumed to quiet the ego and reduce self-enhancement. Mana, again Sanskrit for self-enhancement, is one of the 5 poisons of the mind. So self-enhancement, mana, poisons the mind, and the cure for this is mindfulness meditation. Mindfulness meditation is presumed to have health benefits, and this is also a well-accepted idea in psychology. I'll describe first the yoga study. We did that in Germany within subjects design. We had many assessments over 15 weeks. So in the experimental group, so to speak, we had participants go through yoga exercises for 90 minutes, and then we measured self-enhancement. Does engaging in yoga exercises make you believe that you are superior to other people around you who also engage in yoga exercises? In the control group, we have the self-enhancement measures first, and then had participants engage in yoga exercises. In particular, the yoga class, which lasted for 90 minutes, a real yoga class. It lasted for 90 minutes and consists of 4 stages: postures, breathing exercises, meditation, and relaxation. Participants indicated the extent to which these yoga exercises were important to them. That's the self-centrality measure. Then they compared themselves to the average participant in the yoga class. Are you superior to other people here in terms of those 4 domains of exercise? We assessed communal narcissism, and we also assessed self-esteem as an admittedly weak index of self-enhancement. People who engaged in yoga exercises and then completed the measures, the experimental group, regarded yoga exercising, those yoga exercises, as more important to them, as more self-central to their self-concept. They thought they were superior to their classmates. They were more communally narcissistic, and they had higher self-esteem. And self-centrality mediated all these effects. It's a sissy-brissy principle in effect. So yogis, a reason yogis thought of themselves as superior to their peers is because yoga exercises were important to them. How about mindfulness meditation? That's my favorite study, and I'm not sure why. The design was the same as before. In the experimental group, so to speak, it was all within subjects. In the experimental group, you have meditation first, then self-enhancement measures. In the control group, you have measures first, then meditation. And then we engage in the experimental manipulation, which is go back. I have a love-hate relationship with this. One more. There it is. Oops. Yeah, or no. Yeah. The experimental manipulation involved an online loving kindness meditation. It's quite a widespread form of meditation, lasts for 15 minutes, and it's relying on this principle of guided meta-chanting. It's very simple. Participants start by saying, may I be healthy and free from suffering, free from hate, greed, and narrow mindedness, safe and secure, happy. Then may, and then they bring to mind a person they like, and repeat that. Then a neutral person, and repeat the whole thing. Then a person they dislike, they repeat the whole thing. Then all humans, they repeat the whole thing. And then all beings on earth, including tigers and elephants and chimpanzees, and they repeat the whole thing, right? And that's supposed to relax you and quiet the ego. We assess the centrality of the extent to which is important for participants to reap the fruit of this online kindness, loving kindness meditation. How important is it for you to be a kind-hearted person and free from egoism? We assess the better than average effect in terms of the extent to which they thought were superior to others in terms of kind-heartedness and egoism. Communal narcissism we assessed, and so did we self-esteem. Additional measures of self-enhancement. Well, people who meditated first thought that being a kind-hearted person were more important to them, and because of that, partly because of that, they thought of themselves as superior to other people who meditated, and they scored higher on communal narcissism and self-esteem. So again, the Sisi-Brisi principle upheld. People engaged in mindfulness meditation thought of themselves as superior to those around them who also engaged in mindfulness meditation. And this is the cumulative results consistent with the principle with rather massive base factors. I would argue then that the Sisi-Brisi principle is indeed universal. It is an essential part of human nature, and all those theories are not wrong. They rely on solid foundations. As you know, I love acronyms, so I thought I will end with an acronym, Theo Vev Muf Olit Me, which means thank you very much for listening to me. Oh, it ruined it. For listening to me, go back, go back. These are my collaborators. Thank you very much for listening to me. And I want to pay tribute to my collaborators, a group of fine people who disappeared, and Johann Gebauer was in the middle. And thank you very much for listening to me.
Thank you very much, Constantine, for a very original talk, both theoretically, thoughtful, and empirically, that makes also, let's say, provocative findings for a couple of traditions, cultural traditions, and religions. So it's to the audience now for questions. We have good time for discussion.
Thank you very much for that revealing set of concepts and data. In cross-cultural psychology, there is currently some disagreement about what is meant by the term universal. Yesterday morning, we heard a talk in which I think the idea was that a universal meant something that was completely invariant across cultures. And today, the meaning of universal appears to be that there is a process that is shared by all people everywhere, but appears to different extents and in different forms, depending on cultural context. I personally subscribe to the version that I've characterized as yours, and I wondered whether you had any comments about the alternative meaning of universal. That is, it's got to be exactly the same everywhere, or if not, then it's relativist.
Many thanks for your comment. Yes, I fully agree with the second viewpoint also. The first viewpoint, that it has to be the same everywhere, otherwise it doesn't qualify as universal, is untenable. In terms of psychological principles, we know about variance and the tremendous power of variance on human functioning. So it's untenable. I would argue for the second one, and this has been our argument all along. What we care about is motivation, the motive to self-enhance, not how it's been manifested. It's manifested in a myriad ways. Even among Westerners, we have identified, for example, about 90 or 95 ways in which self-enhancement is manifested in the West. And you'd expect same number or even more in the East. So we have drawn a distinction between the motivation to self-enhance and the way in which people are allowed to express this motive in obedience to cultural norms. This is not the only motive they have. The mixed motives metaphor is there. We have so many motives, and an important one is to be accepted and be a good citizen. Right? So people are very tactical, our argument is, very sensitive to cultural context, and they try to express and satisfy the motive for self-enhancement in ways that is compatible with many other goals they have. So yes, the second viewpoint has it.
I often think that what's called mind-body is not really true to the mind-body association, but rather disembodiment of the body so that the mind can debrief. And it goes back to the Latin phrase, mens sana in corpore sano, where both mind and body are contained within the sense of self. And I wonder thereby if you had a true mind-body relationship, a significance of the correlation of the experience of the mind and the body contemporaneously, whether you get a different form of self-construal.
So in this case, what I would need to do is establish some variance in terms of the perceived link, sensation between mind and body, right? Say high-low. So you have participants who perceive the dissociation between mind and body and those who don't, true? And the prediction would be what? That the more participants perceive a unity between mind and body, the less likely they are to self-enhance. But you need to also make a comparative judgment to assess how others feel in terms of their mind-body perceptions, right? The argument would be, the prediction would be, from the principle's perspective, would be that the more important it is for you to perceive a unity between mind and body, the more likely you are to feel superior in this domain compared to others. You've achieved it, and the other losers haven't yet, sort of thing. It's a testable proposition, isn't it?
It seems that that a prototypical example for Sisi Brisi effect is that of achievement or competence, and people are awarded by being the best. So these are the social cultural practices. Psychologists and others, filmmakers may be awarded for the best film, for the best book, for the best paper, poster, and so on, and not that much for being the most modest person. Or to make it absurd, you will never be perhaps awarded for being the worst author of a book or of a paper. So this is why maybe the problem exists, that the prototypicality of self-enhancement lies in where there are exact and very explicit cultural forms of being awarded, of being at the limelight, whereas in the modesty or moral religiosity aspect, it's well, self-enhancement is tacit, is not that much. It's rather recognized maybe only by yourself, or it gets less feedback or less prominent feedback than in the competence or achievement area. How would you comment this, Constantine?
Well, I'm not overall. I'm not sure that people self-enhance more on the competence domain than the morality domain. It's we have our studies indicate the other way around. It's the condition there, getting back to John's point, the condition there that determines higher versus lower self-enhancement is verifiability. So if I argue that I'm really competent, you can ask me to prove it, and you should. Why do I think I'm competent? Is really my IQ higher than others? What have I done, really? And you can challenge me seriously and prove that I'm incompetent. But if I say that I'm moral, what are you going to do about it? You don't know my life. I may be moral. So I have more elbow room in arguing that I'm moral that I'm competent. Morality is to a greater degree unverifiable than is competence. And indeed, morality is important to people. You can argue that morality underlies a lot of professional relations also. An argument has been made, for example, that morality, the need for moral self-enhancement or communal narcissism underlies the replication crisis. The fact that many people are so uptight about it. That makes them feel good. It's an argument. So morality permeates a lot of our behavior, the need to self-enhance on moral domains. I would argue that it's very important.
Thank you. Two hopefully quick questions. One is about the samples. Whether, say, German students are the best sample to test people who are really into the philosophy of yoga or the philosophy of mindfulness. And also with the Christian sample, I do MTurk studies as well. I've never seen an MTurk sample with so few Christians, only a third of the sample. Did you actually restrict it to people who were practicing Christians, or was it everyone? So that's the sample question. The other quick one is the measurement. So you talked about, the measurement is basically, am I better than average? Would it be detrimental to your theory if you also ask the question, there are many people in this class who are better at this than me? Because I could see they could answer positively to both. And if they agreed and said there are many people in this class who are better than me, would that be evidence against self-enhancement?
Thank you, Vassilis. In terms of the sampling question, it was samples of convenience. We could do the study in Germany because we had the resources. Besides those two studies, we did another study on Buddhist, different forms of Buddhist mainstream meditation, which I'll present later today, and we replicated these findings. In terms of the religiosity sample, no, we've done many studies on religiosity. One of the samples that we had was something like 2.5 million. So we've replicated these findings very well across about a dozen studies with huge samples. So I'm more confident about the religiosity sample than the other samples, although across three not massive samples, the effect seems to be consistent. In terms of your other question, we haven't framed the question this way because this way of framing the question has not been validated yet. I'd like to validate this measure. And I'm very curious to see what the results are like. It'd be a nice way to do that, nice way to assess, to test the principle that way. Yeah, I agree.
Exactly here, on the distinction between morality or competence, or more broadly, communion and agency. So actually communion and morality is a part of it. It's another profitable dimension. So actually it's a feature, it's a set of features which serve other people. The fact that I'm moral is good for others more than for myself, actually. Whereas the competence is the other way around. So actually you should enhance more, self-enhance more on those if you want actually to have a good feedback from others, okay, on the morality dimension, or whereas you enhance on this competence dimension just for yourself. So it's a good for your own self-feedback, but it's maybe threatening for others if you show off and show that you are better on the dimensions that are important to others. So actually I would expect the pattern that you have mentioned rather than what Pavel would assume.
Yeah, actually the kind of results you showed and the kind of process and methodology you used, it makes it more probable to get the kind of results you have. because this is one position, you see, if you ask common people or students or your sample, this is the kind of result which is expected. Because there's another position, which is linked to time and self-evolvement, you see. So that is a position that it takes time to evolve, you see, and there are people who have gone beyond that, you see. So I have serious objections about the method and the sample, everything to study a subject like this, which has deeper implications. Thank you.
Of course, we are aware of that, and we were very attentive to, I did not present these results. We looked at expert versus novice, yogis and mindfulness meditation people. And guess what we found? Exactly the opposite of what you are suggesting. The more expert you are, the more you self-enhance. The finding is equivalent to that of Chinese state employees. Right? The ego-quieting view would predict exactly the opposite of what we found. They would say, well, you know, you should find self-enhancement among westernized university students, but not among Chinese state employees. And we find exactly the reverse. It's Chinese state employees who self-enhance because Chinese cultural values are important to them. Likewise, expert yogis and mindfulness meditation people self-enhance more because a reason is that these facets, these domains are more important to them.
Hi. So I have a question that dovetails pretty well on the last question, I think. So in the decision-making literature, if you want to show evidence of overconfidence, you ask people like 40 questions of how confident they are about their answer to a binary question, and then you look at how many they really got correct. And you say, well, okay, the average confidence is above or below the number they actually got correct, or the percentage they got correct. And so it's possible in some of these things that people who actually engage in yoga or engage in mindfulness meditation really are better than other people at transcending the ego. For example, if I practice baseball and it's important to me, I'm going to get better than other people at baseball who don't practice. So I'm just wondering, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, thank you. That's the problem with measures like the better than average effect and communal narcissism is that, as you pointed out, they're group level measures. You can tell overall how the group behaves, but you have no idea how the individual behaves, and many of them may be right. So if Messi says that he's the best football player, well, he is. And that's why we use this criterion discrepancy measure, the overclaiming task, where you know whether people self-enhance or not. And when you look at that task alone, you do find the same effect you obtain with the better than average effect and communal narcissism.
In my research on dating couples, I ask people to rate themselves and their partner on things like how intelligent, creative, attractive, desirable as a partner. And on a scale from 1 to 9, I find that the people rate themselves above average. I also find that they rate their partners even higher than themselves, and how much they rate their partners higher than themselves depends on how much they love their partners until they break up.
Yes, when I was at North Carolina, I had many discussions about that with my colleague, Carol Raspold, and her argument was similar to yours, that it's a matter of interdependence. So if you're highly interdependent with someone, a friend, a partner, it's important for you that this person does well. And so, but then I would argue that that's true. It's true, I can tell. The same happens with my friends and spouse and everything. But that's because you internalize the other person into your self-concept. So in a magical and mysterious way, the other person becomes you. Their successes are your successes. Yeah. But when you break up, yeah, that's a bit weird.
The question I have is really related to the one which I asked just now about, it's the accuracy question. So is there any work out, so the self-enhancement effect is a group level effect, but is there any evidence that the rankings, that people who self-enhance a lot as opposed to, say, people who self-enhance a little, does that reflect reality in the competence domain and the morality domain? Is there evidence out there on that? Have people taken objective measures which allow us to give an answer to that question?
Well, first, let me say that indeed many measures of self-enhancement are group level, but some are not. But in terms of your substantive point, it's very interesting. It's when you look at, say, self-esteem or narcissism as predictors of self-enhancement, you typically find that they do not predict actual performance. So you have those studies where people started finding that men, for example, before task performance, predicted that they will do very well compared to women. After task performance, they would say, I did very well compared to women. And then you look at what they did, and they did not do better than women. And the mediating variable was self-esteem or narcissism. We know from the narcissist literature that narcissists do not do better than low narcissists. So it is, to go back to the overconfidence idea, it is a matter of enhancement, really. It's the motivation. It's motivation. The motivation does not always translate into accuracy, although I would argue that recent data also indicate that when you induce self-enhancement, you find that people become more creative in some tasks. So there may be an effect there, but if there is an effect, it's probably small. Self-enhancement, I would argue, predicts more like persistence, task persistence. And if it leads to success, it's through task persistence rather than anything else.
Thank you. I'm curious about your argument about universality of this principle. And I'm curious about your train of thoughts when you are to relate this work with work on values as proposed by Shalom Schwartz, because to me this reminds me of his what he calls achievement and perhaps also autonomy. So how do you see this as a way to go further to argue about the universalism of this principle, rather than looking at China alone or two other different contexts in the social life? So more to elaborate on human values as what has been already confirmed to be more or less universal.
The most relevant dimension probably with the self-transcendence versus self-enhancement value that Schwartz outlines. Right? This is probably what I was talking about, but I would argue that the Sedikides principle is more broader than that. It can be applied to any value. So, for example, if I value autonomy, if autonomy is important to me, well, I think that I'm more autonomous than you, than the average person in this room, and so on and so forth. So it's the flexibility of the Sedikides principle that I would argue for. But in terms of positioning self-enhancement broadly, I would say, yeah, that's just one dimension out of the several that he's identified and other colleagues have identified. We have many motives and many values, and self-enhancement, self-transcendence is just one of them.
We are almost about to finish, but just a very small question before the break. No, it's just to come back to the morality specificity, as moral perfectionism seems to be the specific, let's say, content stuff for self-enhancement of Christians. Traditionally, at least for the Christianity, but perhaps for all the other monotheistic religions, the idea, literally speaking, is that paradise exists, and then there is no room for everybody. So it's not only that all we have to be moral, but there is room for some, the selected. So my question simply is that perhaps this literal understanding of what will be the next life has transformed the moral perfectionism also in terms of competitiveness.
I agree, very nice. This is what a psychologist of religion would contribute to this debate. Yeah, thanks, I agree. And thank you, all of you, very, very much for being here that early in the morning, and I appreciate your questions. Thanks a lot.